Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I am joined by Philip Dunshea, who is a senior acquisitions editor for Peter Lang. He studied medieval history at St. Andrews and then went to Cambridge for an MPhil and a PhD. He subsequently lectured in Celtic history at the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic at Cambridge until his career changed to academic publishing. It's so nice to see you, Phil, and to have a chance to speak to you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Heather.
One of the aspects that I'd like to get into that will form, I think, the backdrop for this entire episode is a book that you introduced me to just a few weeks ago that has really started to change my perspective on pilgrimage, but also my own family history. And this family history is shared with your family history, and there's a bit of an intersection here. So I guess before we really get into talking about the book, you are a senior acquisitions editor for Peter Lang Publishing, and you are the one that acquisitioned my pilgrimage studies book a number of years ago. And it's been fantastic to work with you and to work with the team at Peter Lang and to watch this series start to evolve into something really interesting. One of the interesting pieces about the connection between the two of us is that we have a shared family history, which is geographically based in Eastern Slovakia, and our respective families were Hungarians who were living in Eastern Slovakia and then immigrated. Mine after the First World War, yours later. Mine came to, my great-grandmother moved to the eastern part of the United States in Pittsburgh, and your family moved into England?
That's right.
Wales?
Yes,
Yeah.
England. That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
my maternal grandfather was from a village called Kovácsi in southeast Slovakia, and he came to England in the late 1940s. Yeah.
So we ended up talking very early on after we met each other. And there's so many pieces that that seem to be serendipitous in some ways, because part of it is serendipitous, but we also know some incredible colleagues who made this introduction. But this Slovakia connection has sort of formed a backdrop for many of our conversations, and certainly our conversations after I visited the area of Levocha in the surrounding areas in Eastern Slovakia. And then very recently, you brought a book to my attention, which is called Remembering Peasants, A Personal History of a Vanished World, Patrick Joyce. We're going to hold it up here. And this book, as I mentioned at the beginning, is really changing my view on pilgrimage, partly because of what Joyce states. This is a direct quote. The religious journey called pilgrimage taps the root, and perhaps is itself the root, of a central motif of European culture, that of the transformative journey. And Joyce also gets into peasant pilgrimages. Many of them are oriented, at least in Europe, in the town where my great-grandmother was born, in Levocha. And also, Joyce talks about his own family history and pilgrimages in Ireland, and to another extent, Poland. And so for whatever reason, I think this book is really resonating with both of us. And so I'm interested in now framing the episode as we sort of weave through talking about aspects of this book, as well as the Pilgrimage Studies series and pilgrimages in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book that I've learned a huge amount from. The focus, as you said, is on peasants in Ireland, Slovakia, Poland, and the south of Italy. But almost more than that, it's a book that changes your way of looking at the past, isn't it? And one of the things he's made me think about is the way that peasants had access to a kind of communal understanding of the past. And pilgrimage was a big part of that, down to the middle of the 20th century, and in some cases beyond. But for us living in a more secular society today, we're kind of cut off from that past, aren't we? And perhaps some of the forms of pilgrimage we'll be talking about today are attempts to create an identity and a past for ourselves, which peasants would have taken more or less for granted. It was something they inherited. But for us, we have to sort of strive to find or even create that identity.
One of the remarkable aspects that I've been thinking about this outside of the book, but Joyce, the way that he is describing the peasant pilgrimages and peasant life as being so deeply connected to the land
Oh.
has now altered the way that I'm seeing pilgrimages as perhaps an attempt to reclaim the connection with the land, that perhaps for those of us who descend from this vast, very large, historically broad community of peasants,
Uh-huh.
is this now a way for us to reclaim a peasant past and a deep connection to the earth?
Yeah, yeah, it's true. And if you look around the world, there are huge numbers of people who are living more or less secular lives. They may have some faith, but it may not be attached to an established religion, who are walking as a means of connecting with the physical landscape, aren't there? And one of the fascinating parts of the Joyce book was where he talks about pilgrimage in the Irish landscape, because in Ireland, Catholicism was, for a lot of history, it was sort of a repressed religion, wasn't it? So it doesn't have the same infrastructure of pilgrimage that somewhere like Poland would have, where you have shrines and churches that have been lavished with funds over the centuries. In Ireland, sanctity came to rest in the landscape. So you have certain mountains and certain places that people will travel to in order to connect with that spirituality. And increasingly you have large numbers of people doing the same sorts of things, but without any explicitly Christian motive. Yeah.
One of the aspects of the landscape that I noticed in Eastern Slovakia is it seems every maybe 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, I don't know the exact distance, there's a small roadside shrine. And I don't know if these were utilized as part of pilgrimages. I think they were utilized so that peasants could have the opportunity to pray and have these moments of sacred meditation during their lives that were very burdened with work and with a focus on production
Yeah.
for someone else,
Yeah.
and the cultivation of crops for other people, and yet there are these small, um, yeah, they're just small shrines
Mm.
dotting the landscape. And so this is a point of interest that I'd like to look into more after reading the Joyce book.
Yeah, I mean, it was an incredibly local thing, wasn't it? Every village and every region had its own traditions of pilgrimage. And one of the things that Patrick Joyce doesn't shy away from is that peasant life was incredibly hard for almost everybody, and he doesn't gloss over that. He acknowledges it, and he says that in a way it makes these pilgrimages more interesting and more astounding that they are devoting time and serious effort and increasing their own poverty by doing these pilgrimages against that backdrop.
And also I think one of the things that I took away is this idea that this is a very shared heritage. When I'm thinking about peasants before this point, I'm thinking about a sort of small group of people, but Joyce broadens the aperture, and I think in doing so gives those of us who are descendants of peasants or who are coming from these very rural villages across Europe, who may have ties to the peasant class. This is giving us something tangible to grab onto,
Right.
and in a way to understand our own family
Yeah.
histories.
And in some ways, it's the only thing one can do, because, most of these people didn't leave any written records. They were ignored by the official sources. Or the only thing you can do is go out into the landscape and look for the journeys they would have made, the sites they would have seen, the churches they would have visited. So it's a real way of connection for our generation, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And I was also recalling a moment when I visited the town hall, the mayor's office in, it was either Richnava or Kluknava, and there was a record of one of my ancestors making a journey to Poland, and it was noted in the civil record book. This massive, I mean, this book was,
Mm.
like 3 feet by 18th inch. I mean, it's a massive record of the history of the village. And it now makes me wonder what that person was doing, and why was the journey that was made to Poland so important that it was noted
Yeah.
in this civil registry.
So what decade was this? What period?
I think it would have been at the end of the 19th century. And I don't know how far the history goes back, but it seems to, if I'm remembering correctly, it's several hundred years. So I want to say maybe from early 18th century forward, every important aspect of the village life was recorded, from births and marriages and deaths, and then notations about people's travels as
Yeah.
well.
So I guess it's quite plausible and also quite good that he was going on a pilgrimage to somewhere in Poland.
Possible. It's very possible. And now I want to go back and learn more.
And of course, that's quite a major undertaking because you're crossing the Tatra Mountains, aren't you?
That's right. That's right. And possibly maybe even reconnecting with their ancestors who may have migrated into this area. It's a possibility as well. So now I need to go on another pilgrimage back
Mm.
to Eastern Slovakia so I can track down a possible pilgrimage. And I've told this story. I don't know if I've told it on the podcast, but when my great grandmother, this was in 1970, she sent a postcard to her family in the United States, because she had decided, she was 71 at this point.
Uh-huh.
She was in ailing health, and she wanted to return to her hometown of Lavocha before she died. She also had a tumor on her neck, and she believed that if she could make a pilgrimage back to Lavocha and climb the hill to the Marianska Hora,
Uh-huh.
and go to the cathedral or the basilica at the top of this hill, which is a primary Marian pilgrimage site in Europe, that she would be healed of her tumor. And she sent a postcard to her family from Lavocha stating that she had encountered some people who knew her in the street, and she was really happy that she was recognized. And she even offers some commentary about how modern the women's clothing was, and this was surprising to her.
Yeah.
So it was very different, I
Yeah.
think, than the village that she had left. And anyway, so she makes this pilgrimage by herself at age 70 years old, and she was cured.
Yeah.
Whatever the situation was, this tumor on her neck went away after this pilgrimage, and she ended up living about another decade.
Mm.
So, so even at her old age, I think this was the only time that she went back to her hometown. This was still very much a part of uh, her memory in terms of how one heals
Yeah.
oneself,
Yeah.
which is what Joyce kind of gets into. That there is this kind of peasant, an infusion of peasant spirituality with healing and belief in miracles,
Mm-hmm.
and that these local sites, like the basilica in Lavocha, are places where there is some type of hope that someone can be healed.
That's it. It's about hope, isn't it?
Yes,
And I think one of the things Patrick Joyce explains well is that we shouldn't be condescending about these beliefs because they're an attempt to impose order and some kind of predictability on a world and a landscape that is inherently dangerous, unstable, and often hostile.
that's right. And then the oral tradition of hearing this generation, hearing about these acts of healing or
Oh,
miracles that pass from generation to generation, are sort of a perpetual hope that drives people back to these sacred sites. Because if someone 100 years ago may have been healed or cured from an ailment, then maybe I can too.
yeah.
And so I do think that there are certainly healing motivations that are part of these pilgrimages, in addition to this communion with the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in some ways, the modern understanding of the body brain nexus is catching up with that, isn't it?
It is. In some ways, we're actually returning to some level of wisdom that was held by these peasants for millennia, or at least a millennium.
Have you ever read Kapka Kasabova's books about Bulgaria?
No, I
So
haven't.
she talks. I mean, these are books. They're sort of travel logs, but they talk a lot about peasant communities in very remote parts of Romania and Bulgaria, where herbalism is still a very strong tradition, alongside pilgrimage and often as part of pilgrimage. So you go up into the mountains and you um, acquire particular herbs at particular times of year and then turn them into teas or ointments. And it's a similar kind of issue to what we're talking about. Yeah, highly recommended.
I'll definitely be checking. We just need to go on the road with a book conversation,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
On ongoing,
yeah.
which is probably how you what drew you into publishing to begin with, is this fascination with writing and how ideas are conveyed through the written text.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it was a logical leap for me because I was in academia before I came into publishing, so I kind of knew how to talk shop with academics, and I had my own interests. Um, and what I've always enjoyed about publishing is that it's a balance really between two sides of the same coin. One part of you is trying to be rational and looking at things like sales and what's going on in the market and what people want to read. But the other side of it is about pursuing your own interests and just following your instincts. And I've really enjoyed that side of it. You have more time for it early in your career, I think, to indulge those kinds of pursuits. So I was lucky in a way that pilgrimage studies came to me as an idea for a series very early on. And I think I might actually have mentioned this idea at my job interview with Peter Lang 7 years
Really?
back. Yeah. So yeah, it's been a real thrill to start the series, and I'm so glad I met you early on in the process because I couldn't have asked for a better series editor.
Yeah, we've been having a lot of fun and conversations about directions in pilgrimage studies and what is exciting to both of us and what may be exciting to the market, so to speak, as well as to people who are writing in this space. What about pilgrimage studies seemed so magnetic for you? What was it in your life, either personally or professionally, that brought you into the space to consider this series?
I think academically, it's a wonderful topic because it encompasses so much. You know, within even one volume in pilgrimage studies, you've got historians, psychologists, geographers, theologians. So it's an ideal cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary subject. Um, I think personally speaking, it must have lifted off from somewhere in my childhood. I think I grew up mainly in North Wales, in a quiet part of North Wales, um, in a town called St Asaph, which has a medieval cathedral. It's one of the smallest cathedrals in the UK, possibly in Europe. And we were surrounded by the wreckage of thousands and thousands of years of history. So we had the medieval cathedral. We had within a few miles Norman castles that were 900 to 1,000 years old. Iron Age hill forts that were 2,000 years old. We had Roman roads. We had Bronze Age burial cairns that were 3 or 4,000 years old. And then a couple of miles away from where we lived, we had a cave, the Bont Newydd Cave, which has evidence of Paleolithic humans from 250,000 years ago. So we toured around this wreckage a lot. My parents introduced me to it and educated me about it, but also it became a playground for us as well. So we just sort of took the past for granted. We were immersed in it, and I think that just informed my identity, and it still does to this day. Yeah.
What was it about being amongst the ruins that inspired you?
Everything inspired me about it, I think. Just seeing the landscape as a kind of a palimpsest where you have evidence for so many different periods of time, and being able to move among them, just gave me a thrill, and it still does. It's one of the things I miss about living in the UK, because I live in Canada now. I miss sort of having that easy access to just going for a walk through any old patch of woodland or field and coming across these things, and having to do some mental guesswork about what period these places or these features might date to.
There is something exciting and unique about discovering something that feels unknown or secret, or maybe that one is finding for the first time
Yeah,
or amongst a few people who know about it.
yeah, absolutely, there is. Yeah, and I've been lucky in my life. I've twice found archaeological remains that were previously unknown during just normal walks. These weren't deliberate surveys or digs. These were just walks in the countryside. Um, and possibly the most exciting one I found was on a beach in northeastern Scotland, and it was a Neolithic shell midden. So it was a beachside settlement where the locals had been living and presumably living off shellfish a lot of the year, and they just built up this enormous mound of used shellfish, which were gradually buried by a sand dune, which more recently had been started to erode by the sea. And so these shells, thousands and thousands of shells, were pouring out of the sand dune. And I just thought that's a Neolithic shell midden. And it's not on any map. It's not on any books. That's brand new. Yeah.
What was the purpose of this type of structure?
It's basically a waste tip. It's just over years and decades, they just built up this enormous pile outside the village, presumably, and didn't bother doing anything about it.
So it's sort of where the waste area would
Yeah.
go outside of where
Yeah,
people
more
were
or less.
living.
It's a dump. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a treasure now. Yeah, this is literally the adage, one man's trash is another's treasure, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Um and you also have a lot of experience with hiking, and it seems like I can see the overlap here with an interest in discovering new sites and being amongst ruins and places where humans have been living for thousands of years. And then although in some ways this is two ends of a spectrum, because one is very close. One is right in the midst of where humans have been living, and there have been settlements. And then the hiking is sort of coming out and seeing this from a very distant
Yeah.
perspective.
A wilder perspective. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's interesting because in Wales, you kind of have the two combine in quite a nice way, because if you walk into the hills in Wales, quite often you will find Bronze Age cairns or Iron Age hill forts in places that people no longer live. And there are some parts of the UK that previously were much more densely inhabited than they are today. So mountaineering in a way was doubly beneficial for me, because it got me into the wild, but it also got me deeper into history. But mountaineering as pilgrimage, I mean, that's something I've been thinking a lot recently. Mountaineering is often criticized by some people who aren't mountaineers because it's self-indulgent and it's potentially dangerous, difficult, and expensive, and so on. But I think, for me at least, it's been a huge source of joy in my life. It's immensely rewarding, and it does have similarities with pilgrimage, because you are doing something that has no real rational basis, aren't you? You're undertaking a task that is time consuming. It's a huge amount of effort. It can be dangerous. It leads to no material rewards of any kind. You're doing it just because you find it fun, or you get some reward from it, whether it's spiritual or simply physical. And I think all these things combine for most mountaineers. They wouldn't try to separate the physical from the spiritual rewards. But it's something I got into probably in my early teens. And I did it mainly in Scotland and Wales, and read a lot about mountaineers going to the Himalayas and the Alps. And then we did a family trip to the Alps, to the Swiss Alps, when I was in my mid-teens, and I got to see, the Eiger for the first time with my parents. And that was a pilgrimage for me, because this is a mountain that has 100 years of pretty bonkers mountaineering history. It's a place that most mountaineers will want to see at some point in their lives. I wouldn't ever want to climb it necessarily, but yeah.
You're you're I mean, I hear the message clearly that mountaineering may be maybe seen, maybe viewed as self-indulgent, and maybe doesn't benefit others. And yet some of the world's and historical, the most prominent historical religious figures often have brought back some type of very important insights or revelations after being on a mountain.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, there's Mount Kailas in Tibet, which is a pilgrimage site for hundreds of millions of people, isn't it? Yeah. And you've got mountains in Ireland, Mount Brandon in Ireland, and all over the world, they have been places where man communes with the divine. And I think mountaineers would feel some affinity with that idea.
I mean, even the Ten Commandments.
Yeah,
If we're
yeah,
looking at Judeo-Christian religious tradition, Moses receives these commandments, these utterances from God on top of a mountain. And so I think the case can be made that there is a societal benefit for traveling to some type of mountain peak or summit or hilltop,
right.
and the internal insights or revelations, or if if this is part of your religious tradition, the actual utterances of God are given on these mountaintops.
Mhm.
I think there's a pretty big wider societal impact than from maybe just one person going on top of a mountain.
Undoubtedly, yeah. And just to go back to Patrick Joyce one more time, if I may.
As we will.
If I,
Yes, yeah, please.
um, he talks about this idea that we've lost a communal past, and a communal identity, and he says identity has become much more individualistic, and mountaineering can be seen as part of that because you are building an identity for yourself through, in some ways, an artificial struggle, but a struggle nevertheless, isn't it? That you've decided that will be some part of your identity. Um, and in some ways, you're searching for meaning in life. And a lot of mountaineers spend their weekends doing this mad activity because they're looking for some sense of meaning. And it's the same as pilgrimage in that sense.
And in 2025, a lot of pilgrims are seeking their own sort of self actualization or encounter with a divine presence or energy, and
Mm.
it isn't necessarily a communal experience. So I've been thinking about what that means, because for many people, the pilgrimage is motivated by some type of internal individual quest that, yes, may have to do with relationships or connection to history or heritage or
Yeah,
a new landscape,
yeah.
but it is still very much originating within the self, rather than being an external communal activity that is engaged in with one's community.
Yes, yeah, that's true. I mean, I did a lot of mountaineering by myself, and it's one of those things that again is open to criticism from people who don't do it themselves because you are more at risk. But I think the rewards are greater in some ways. Um, the writer Rob McFarlane. He,
Yes.
yeah.
Did you see his book is now being made into a feature film?
No, I had no idea.
Yes, it was just announced. I saw it this week on social media. I think it's debuting at the Tribeca Film Festival, so we should be able to see it soon. Are you talking about Underland?
Underland, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But he did an earlier book called Mountains of the Mind, which is about the history of mountaineering. Uh, just on a tangent, mountaineering is a subject with an amazing literature going back 150 years now. And that kind of spirituality and theosophical approach has been a thread running through it all the way through. But Rob McFarlane, at one point, he says that mountaineers are half in love with themselves and half in love with oblivion, which I think is quite a nice idea. And it has that kind of that Buddhist idea of the shedding of self and transcendence at the heart of it.
We would definitely like to see a volume in the Pilgrimage Studies series about mountaineering slash hiking slash walking trails. I think there are enough people writing about mountaineering that we could probably just devote the volume to that particular topic. And I'd love to hear you say more about that. Because it's on my radar, and I hope listeners or viewers who may be writing in this space will consider pitching a proposal for this volume.
Absolutely. I would love to see either an edited collection under perhaps one of our listeners' control, where we get historians, geographers, theologians, psychologists together and get them to discuss all of these different meanings we've been talking about with some kind of academic weight behind them. That would be absolutely glorious. Or we could look for somebody to write a monograph with a more kind of personal bent on all of this. And I think, mountaineers, it's certainly one of the more literate sports. There are lots of academics who indulge in this kind of thing, like Rob McFarlane. Perhaps we could even approach him to do it. Mountaineering's pilgrimage, but
That would be
it's something
amazing.
with it almost lends itself to a strongly biographical dimension, which is something that I'm very pleased is coming back into academic writing, because it's kind of been pushed down and seen as unscientific in the recent past. But I think if we acknowledge that all academic work has personal, selfish motivations, doesn't it? And we need to acknowledge those and bring them back into the published academic work.
I agree, and I think that's one of the exciting elements about being the series editor and working with you on the Pilgrimage Studies series. I'm also very interested in seeing a volume on sex and pilgrimage, which has been addressed a bit within gender studies, but not beyond that. And I think it's an important taboo where we think about pilgrimages as holy journeys and holy experiences, and yet there are oftentimes sexual elements to this which are never discussed.
Yeah.
So I would be very interested to speak to people who may be writing in this space and want to contribute to a volume on
Yeah, and
this.
perhaps some of our listeners might be today.
Yeah, that's right. That would be fantastic. How do you how do you envision the growth of this series?
I would like to make it the foremost pilgrimage studies series. I know we have a couple of competitors who are slightly longer established than we are, but I think we can offer potential contributors some advantages. We're a rapid publisher. We can move quickly once the books are in production. We can be very flexible. I really am open to almost any pitch within pilgrimage studies, and we've been discussing some of the areas, but there are dozens and dozens more that we could invite on board as well. So I'd just like to make it a really kind of ecumenical place, just conversations between everyone who has a stake in this field.
One of the rewarding parts of being the series editor has been a new volume that I'm co-editing with my French colleagues Stéphane Michonneau and Frank Viltar, called Pilgrimages to the Western Front of World War I, Historical Exemplars and Contemporary Practices. I don't know that a book like this would have been published even 10 years ago, because we're making the case that World War I, post World War I pilgrimages are important, and that they can be subsumed into the overarching umbrella of pilgrimage studies. And so we're looking at battlefields and monuments and memorials as pilgrimage spaces, in addition to being landscapes of war, and the activities that happen at these sites as pilgrimages. Certainly in the interwar era, veterans and their families going to sites, particularly in the Western Front, along the Western Front, were calling their journeys pilgrimages. So this wasn't a stretch. This is what the people themselves were calling what they were doing. But the practices have continued, and so this is a really interesting part of my work and a rabbit hole that I don't know that I will ever get out of, because it has like more and more rabbit holes once I get into it. And it has also opened the aperture for many military historians who study war and memory to conceptualize their work in a different way or a new way, and is giving them um, access to different ways of publishing their work and to bringing their work to a wider audience. So I'm the book hopefully will be out very soon. If all goes according to plan, hopefully early summer, at least early summer in the northern hemisphere. Hopefully it won't be early summer in the southern hemisphere. That would be very disappointing if it takes that long. So we're really looking forward to this volume, and I actually can foresee a time where we will be publishing other volumes that have to do with post-war pilgrimages.
Absolutely. And I think there's something to be done with the Second World War as well, because it's obviously we don't have those enormous cemeteries on the Western Front. This, we don't have the equivalent of that. But my just to tell a personal story, my other grandfather, my paternal grandfather, he was in the Merchant Navy, and he was captured by the Germans in the Indian Ocean in 41, I think, and he was taken to Bordeaux and put on a train towards a POW camp. And he and a couple of his friends jumped off the train and walked through France to the Pyrenees and across the Pyrenees into Spain. And that's sort of, it's obviously it's a major theme within my family's history. And 10 years ago or so, I went to that part of southwestern France, and although I didn't know his exact route across the Pyrenees, I tried to recreate more or less the route that he would have taken. I mean, one of the problems was that he was being helped by the resistance, and they were pretty careful about keeping their route secret. So nothing was written down. But we do have his account of the journey, and it all sounds very exciting.
Yeah, and I think this actually connects with a lot of people that I know, their family histories, where people really want to go retrace the footsteps of their ancestors. And many times the context for that is war or something that happened right after the war, because our lives were so deeply impacted, I think, familially, uh, because of war.
Yeah.
And it's very much a part of the family oral tradition, as well as there seems to be, I think the pandemic was a perfect kind of incubator for this, where people were wanting to learn more about their families, and so they were doing a lot of work online and trying to piece together different moments of the past and how they create this very broad family narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because people were, as you say, they had the time and the inclination to do this research during the pandemic, but also they were cut off from making the journeys. So you have that kind of pressure building, don't you, during the pandemic? And then suddenly, after lockdown ends, everyone wants to actually make these journeys and go to see these places for themselves. Yeah, because life became very virtual for a while, didn't it?
It did, and I think this actually would be another interesting volume having to do. It's definitely an area I'm interested in. Is this topic of virtual pilgrimages, but particularly those pilgrimages which are formed. The seeds are sort of planted virtually, and then it leads to some type of in person plan or trip
Yeah,
after
yeah,
the fact.
yeah. Just going back to my vision for the series, we talk a lot about these individual pilgrimages that people in the West do a lot nowadays, but I'd also like to include more coverage of people who are doing more conventional religious pilgrimage in other parts of the world, which they're still doing in their millions and hundreds of millions, aren't they?
That's right.
Especially in parts of Asia and South America.
That's right. I think we have uh, maybe paved a little pathway with our volume on post World War One pilgrimages, in the sense that some of the contributors have written in French and others in English. And while this is maybe challenging in some ways, I think that it's definitely an aspect that you and I are both committed to, which is opening this large stage for people who experience pilgrimage and write about pilgrimage from a variety of cultural backgrounds as well as linguistic backgrounds. And so the intent from the beginning was to always provide a space for people to write in their native language,
Mhm. Mhm.
as long as we have people, reviewers who can review the
Right.
proposal in
Yeah.
those languages. Um, on the topic of your role as a senior acquisitions editor, uh, what does that entail? Like, I think that it in some way it's like Neo behind the scenes or the Wizard of Oz,
Yeah.
and I mean I certainly haven't experienced a disconnect. We write and speak frequently.
Yeah.
Um, but what does that look like? And how do you kind of from a pragmatic standpoint, how do you work with authors?
Well, the job takes authors through from the proposal stage. So that's the pitch where either the author will approach me or I will approach them with an idea in mind. And we talk about what the book might look like, who the audience is, whether it fits one of our series. And then we get it peer reviewed, which often involves a draft manuscript or a couple of sample chapters. And then often there is a bit of a gap where the author is left in peace to get on with the writing and the revisions and so on. And then at the end of that process, my job is to make sure that the final manuscript is up to the task and that they've paid attention to the peer reviewers, and then submit it to the production team. And then the production team send it through typesetting and design and all of that stuff. And then right at the end, I will see the proofs, hopefully, and sign off on those. And then the book goes out into the world. So you've got this kind of production line going on all the time, and every book is at a different stage. So in some ways, this is a project management book. Sorry, a project management job that I do. Um, and at any one time, I've got somewhere between 50 and 100 books ongoing. Some of those are just at the pipe dream stage. Some of them are going to press. And there's tons of troubleshooting along the way, and firefighting and helping authors with style sheets and helping authors with getting permissions to reproduce images in their books, that kind of thing. So it's a nice varied job. Um, and once in a while, not as often as I would like, you get time to talk with new authors and new editors about, planning new series and looking at new directions for the publishing list. So yeah, it's an enjoyable job. It's very varied, and it's great in the sense that you talk to academics in dozens of different fields, which I really, really like. I loved my own field. I still do, which is early medieval Celtic history. But I get to sort of apply the thinking I learned in that to all these other subjects. So it's great.
There are some parallels with what you've just described, with my role as a series editor, in terms of working directly with authors and helping them envision how their their contribution fits within the volume or the series, which is fun. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I'm really enjoying this podcast, also because it does allow this time and space to learn about a lot of different aspects, kind of in a very focused, expedited manner, and go into a little bit of a research rabbit hole for a truncated period of time, and that's really fun. And there's also at times it can be like herding cats, trying to get everyone on the same page and using the same format
Yeah.
and following instructions from the editorial staff at Peter Lang. So that part is not so fun, and sometimes I feel like a nagging mother, to try and try and get the children to clean up their rooms or to follow a direction. But it's been really fun, and I look forward to many more volumes.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
as you say, this is a carrot and stick kind of role, isn't it? Sometimes, and
yes,
yeah, you have to sometimes read out the riot act and say this book needs to be published by this date. Let's crack on. Um, but then there are times, when you have to be very diplomatic and sensitive because you're dealing with material that people have spent months or years working on it. It's been poured out of their souls, and you have to respect that. Particularly with peer review, I think I would like to say most academic peer reviewers know how to be sensitive and diplomatic, and they play by the rules. But there are always some who sort of just end up writing, "Why hasn't this author written the book I would have written?" And you have to work out how to broach that with the original author as carefully and sensitively as possible, because you need to make these things constructive, don't you?
That's right. They're not meant to be dream killers. And you're right. For people who are writing and academics, I think in general, the intellectual contributions that we make and our thoughts that we put out are very personal. I mean, it's hard to detach from one's ideas. I don't know that that actually can happen.
Mm.
I would definitely welcome a challenge to that, but I I've not seen that to be the case where a person spends quite a lot of time in thought and developing ideas and then putting those out into the world. Yeah, it's a sensitive
It
business.
is, yeah. And on peer review, it's a flawed system, but as I think as Churchill said of democracy, it's a flawed system, but it's much better than the alternatives. So
Yeah, that's right. And that actually brings me to a question about there's a kind of rumblings in a lot of spaces that I exist in about the future of academic publishing, and a lot of people are a bit disgruntled by academic publishing, and I can imagine you know all of the reasons
yeah.
why. What do you say to the idea that academic publishing is dying?
Well, I hope it's not dying. I think I can see where the grievances come from. I think it's in some ways it's more relevant in fields like economics or the sciences, where you have authors who are under huge pressure to publish endless journal articles and are having to pay vast amounts of money for the privilege of doing it. Um, I think in traditional humanities monographs, which is what I do, it's it's less of a problem for us. Um, we do have issues to face. I mean, there's one of the issues we're dealing with at the moment is open access, and where authors can get funding for that, whether it's from the universities or from another grant. It's undoubtedly a good thing because it does increase the impact of their books. We've found that a book that's published open access, it can be read anywhere in the world by anyone for free anytime. But it also paradoxically leads to an increase in sales of the physical book as well. So it's always a good thing if we can get funding for that. It's in North America, open access funding is quite fragmentary. It really depends on the university concerned and the individual's funds. Whereas in Europe, it's increasingly part of one of the requirements of funding that you have to publish open access. So it's different everywhere. The price of academic books is unfortunately out of my control. A lot of it's about the simple cost of printing these things. A hardback book is not cheap to produce, and you're not selling tens of thousands of these books, so you cannot generate profits that way. So I understand the grievances, but I think we're all doing the best we can.
I think that one aspect of academic publishing, going back to what you were mentioning about peer review, I do think there's a lot of value in having one's peers review and offer commentary and possible areas that have been missed or directions that would enhance the writing or the topic in some way. One element that I do hear many academics talking about is this idea that there is not a lot of financial benefit for academics to publish with academic publishing houses. What do you have thoughts about that?
Well, Peter Lang do this. I think a lot of academic publishers do it. We give out book vouchers in return for peer review work. But I mean, going back to when I was an academic, my understanding was that this was part of the job because you needed your work peer reviewed, and therefore you did it for other people. And it's a service to the scholarly community rather than to the publisher.
And what about for the authors?
For the authors, well, I think a good, well written, constructive peer review is an amazing thing to receive because it can only improve the quality of your work. You're getting somebody who knows your field, hopefully as well as you do, to to comment on the quality and the scope of your work. And there are always things that will annoy you about it and rankle, but I think peer reviewers. I always explain to authors that they don't have to do every single thing that peer reviewers ask them to do. What they have to do is give the comments serious consideration and at least take them into account when they're revising their book.
Mm. Are there any books that you have brought in into your portfolio that have personally impacted you, that you have been um, either transformed by or have really just deeply impacted you as a person?
Um, well, I did publish a monograph last year by somebody who was in the late stages of cancer, dying of cancer. He was in his 80s, a guy called Michael Ryan, about intersections of philosophy and poetry in 19th century America. Um, and he was very late in his life when we published this book, and he was in and out of hospital the entire time we were writing the book, editing it, and sending it through production. And he lived, fortunately, until we got the final proofs to him, and he was able to okay the final proofs, but never got to see the book actually published. And that was obviously quite hard hitting because I'd got to know him well over the years. But I'd played a very small part in getting his book out into the world, and he knew it was going to happen. He died knowing that the book was ready to go to press. So that was a good outcome from a horrible situation.
Yeah, I can imagine it would have been very difficult for both of you to go through this, knowing where the outcome was probably going to be in terms of the loss of his life, and one's work can live on, one's thoughts can live on, which
Yeah,
I
and
think
that's one
is
of the great things about publishing is that it's a small part, but you are bringing people's thoughts and work out into the world, and they may not be around forever, but the book will certainly be there for a long, long time as a kind of
yeah, that's
memorial.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Have you noticed a shift in the types of books that are being pitched or the themes that are uh, sort of emerging or rising to prominence?
I have. I think the last 5, 10 years within humanities, there's been a definite shift towards cross-disciplinary projects. And I think that's where a lot of the funding is going at the moment, that you have to have impact outside your own field. And I think there are good aspects to it. I mean, it would worry me if we went into a completely post-disciplinary world where people's specialisms didn't matter anymore. But I think any dialogue between, let's say, historians and archaeologists or historians and theologians can only be a good thing, because academic knowledge nowadays, there is so much of it out there that we do become almost hermits in our own field sometimes. There is a danger of that anyway, because it takes so long to acquire the knowledge you need to practice in that field that there isn't time to read anything else, is there?
Wondered in talking to academics from various fields about methodology and whether our methodologies are actually more similar in many ways, but we call them something different.
Yeah.
It would be interesting. I mean, I attempted to do this a bit in the multidisciplinary perspectives on pilgrimage volume, um, to to challenge authors to talk about the types of methods that they use in their respective disciplines, to
Yeah.
think about how methodologically we work together, not just kind of conceptually or have this disciplinary paradigm where I look at pilgrimage through a psychology paradigm, and someone else does, through anthropology or medieval history. But we actually think about, from a methodological standpoint, how do we access this
Yeah.
information?
Yeah.
And do you see volumes kind of going in this direction to look at, if we're talking about cross-disciplinary, or we're actually also talking about methodological concerns?
We are. Yeah. And I would argue that uh, along with that should go consideration of the kind of language that we use, and terminology, because I find the very best academic authors use language that's quite simple and completely free of their kind of disciplines jargon.
Yes.
There's a great medievalist historian of late antiquity called Peter Brown, and he said he always writes his books with one person in mind as a potential reader, and that person was his auntie in Dublin when he was growing up. And he said she was a woman that didn't get any higher education. She didn't go to university, but she was intelligent and she liked reading. And he says that's who we should be writing for as academics.
We'd
So
certainly
always
have
think about,
wider impact.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
it. Yeah. So always be thinking about the possibility that your book will be picked up by a general reader rather than an academic.
And that is counterintuitive,
Very.
actually,
Yeah.
where many of us, from an ego standpoint, we want to make sure that we seem credible and we sound intelligent and we're clever and we have something innovative to say that maybe others haven't said. And so we create languages
Yeah.
and terminology around that so that we can appear to be brilliant. And that isn't maybe necessarily the best strategy
Yeah,
when
and it's true of publishing as well. Publishing is full of terms that will mean nothing to the outside world, but publishers use them all the time without thinking. And it's that jargon that creates boundaries between different professions, isn't it? And it, in some ways, it's defensiveness, isn't it?
it is. And yes, because we all want to be in some ways superior, or have a higher rank in some way than other people.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's human nature. And certainly the academy is known for this.
yes, yeah, indeed.
What piece of advice do you have for someone who is maybe thinking about publishing for the first time, or has an idea either for an edited volume or a monograph?
Yeah, I would say talk to people as much as possible. Talk to your colleagues. You know, if you're a newly started academic, talk to your PhD supervisor. If you want to turn your dissertation or your thesis into a monograph, talk to your colleagues, and reach out to acquisitions editors or commissioning editors, because they will be able to guide you through this process. I've got a couple of documents on this very subject about publishing your first book, so I can easily send those out to potential authors. Because there's lots to think about. There's lots to think about in terms of reworking your doctoral material, in terms of whether a series might be suitable, market, and also the right publisher. You know, there are dozens and dozens of publishers who might be interested in your book, so you need to find the right one for you.
That makes sense. And I am guessing you're easily discoverable online.
Yes, yeah, hopefully, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You can Google me, and my Peter Lang email address is on the
Okay.
on the webpage. Yeah,
All right. Um, Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today about pilgrimages and about peasants and publishing. Yeah, pilgrimage, peasants, and publishing. There we have such an interesting title for an episode, maybe.
yeah,
Uh, I just want to come back and say thank you to Patrick Joyce
absolutely,
for
yeah,
helping frame our conversation with his book, or through his book. And I have a final question for you that I love to ask, because I love the variety of responses and they enhance my understanding of pilgrimage. And
uh,
so the question that I want to end with is, what is pilgrimage?
excellent question. And I could write a book on the answer. as people have done, I suppose. Um, for me, pilgrimage is something that takes you beyond your ordinary life in pursuit of some higher understanding or meaning. Very often involving effort, hardship, potentially danger.